Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Veganic Gardener's Question Time. It's wonderful to have you with us here today. And now, more than ever, it's vital that we engage with how our food is grown. And by growing your own food veganically, you're part of a growing revolution, which can not only transform your own garden plot, but can also change the way that the world grows its food. So I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Meg Kelly, and I'm from Learn Veganic. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of the upcoming activities we have that you can join us with. We have a free presentation that we're actually giving in the upcoming days. And you can find out more about this presentation about veganic gardening at learnveganic.com/presentation. And it's a free talk about how you can grow a thriving veggie garden using entirely plant-based fertilizers. So again, you can go register for free. And we also have our Learn Veganic online gardening course that's starting on February 7th. We love running this course every year because it brings together veganic gardeners from around the world who are learning together, and we share veganic gardening techniques that you can use in any context, whether you have a balcony, a forest garden, a permaculture project, a backyard garden plot. And if you'd like to get a discount on that, you can use the coupon code VON15 to save $15. So you can find out more about that at learnveganic.com. So if you've ever wanted to know how to grow organically using only plant-based fertilizers, well, you're in the right place, because here at Veganic Gardener's Question Time, we're going to be answering your questions today. And all of our shows are recorded, so you'll be able to see the recording on YouTube. And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. And during the show, you're welcome to post your comments or questions. We sometimes see them pop up, and if we can sneak in an answer for you, we'll try to get to your questions during the show too. And you can also send in your questions for next month, because Veganic Gardener's Question Time happens every month, so you can send in your questions ahead of time. And before I introduce today's panel, I'd like to tell you more about the Vegan Organic Network's World Map of Veganic Gardens. So this is a map that's free to join, and by becoming part of this map, you can be a catalyst for change. Whether you have some plants growing in pots, or whether you help with a community allotment, or if you have a school veggie patch, or manage a farm, or nurture a garden, whatever the size of your space and whatever level you're at, you can connect with fellow gardeners in your area, become part of a global community, share your bountiful produce, seeds, and knowledge. So join the Vegan Organic Map for free today, and you can go to vonmap.uk to join. So I'd like to introduce you to our two wonderful panelists today. So let's start with Piers Warren. Piers is a conservationist, author, and a keen grower of organic fruits and vegetables. And he's also the author of several books and the co-author of The Vegan Cook and Gardener. So welcome, Piers.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and I imagine that right now, because it's January, you're probably doing a little bit more cooking and a little bit less gardening at this time of the year. But I imagine you've got some veggies that you've saved for the winter. Can you tell us about a couple of the veggies that you're still eating from your garden?
Yeah, in the garden at the moment, we've still got things like leeks and kale, and still some parsnips in the ground. I dug up a few yesterday. And it's that time of the year when, we're all itching to get going and get back in the soil. And actually, this last few days, it's been really quite mild here. I'm in Brighton, right in the south of England. And just a week ago, we were in deep freeze. You know, it was like -4 and everything was frozen solid. But now it's like 10 degrees all of a sudden. So I was tempted outside yesterday to sow some garlic. And so
Nice.
it was really nice to, start putting things in the soil and start thinking about what's going to come up later in the year.
Well, wonderful, Piers, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the gardening advice that you have today on this panel. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'd also like to introduce Than. And Than is a veganic horticulture tutor, a forest gardener, a forager, and an all-round plant enthusiast. So welcome, Than.
Hello, Megan.
And I hear that you have a forest gardening project that you've started. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that's been developing and some of the plants that you've added to your forest garden?
Yes, well, they haven't gone in yet. We've bought some plants and we've propagated some. So this is very much a medicinal forest, kind of also edibles in there. A lot of it at the moment, actually, what we're planting first is really an edible medicinal hedge, a fedge or a medge, as you could call it. Lots of species, some wild service trees. The idea is to also incorporate lots of native species, some which are actually nationally more scarce, like the wild service tree. Some xanthosylum, so your slippery ash, prickly ash, sorry, going in. So yeah, lots of different species, and your hazels, beech for the leaves. Yeah, so it's all going on. I've been a year's delay because we moved in last year, so it's very much the first real thing we're putting in after a year of observation, really.
Yeah, that first year of observation is really important. There's a lot of mistakes that we can avoid, and a lot of better design that we can get in place by taking that 1 year to observe first.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Than, for being here with us. And I think we can get our first question up so that we can find out more about what people are itching to know when it comes to gardening. So we have a question from Kat in Surrey. A year ago, we moved into a new house which has a mature walnut tree in the garden. So that's wonderful to move into a house that already has nut production. We had a good crop of nuts, which we stored in boxes in the shed, but they seem to be going soft and moldy. What are the best ways to store these? So does anyone have a question here? I suppose one question would be what to do with those ones that are already potentially going a little off, or how to tell, and then what can she do next year to have better storage methods? Go for it, Piers.
Well, it does sound like that they were stored damp before they were properly dried, and that's brought on this mold, which is unfortunate. I mean, really, the only thing you can do with those that are already moldy is to crack them open and see what state the kernels are inside and see if they're salvageable. But basically, when you harvest walnuts, they usually drop around October time. And so with a walnut, you have the kernel inside. That's the bit that you eat. And that's encased with the hard brown shell. And then that's often covered with a green fibrous outer casing. So if you pick them from the tree, or if they've fallen off the tree, sometimes these green outer casings fall off, sometimes they don't. The first thing you need to do is to take off this fibrous outer coating. So you're just left with the hard shell underneath. And I warn you, it does stain your fingers black. In fact, you can make an ink from this outer fibrous casing. So you might want to wear gloves when you're doing that. You just rub off this green outer casing. So then you're left with the brown outer shell, and you need to dry these before they go into storage. And there's several ways of doing this. A simple way is to lay the nutshells out on trays. Old seed trays would be fine for this. Just a single layer, and then put them somewhere where ideally they'll get some sun and obviously no rain. So maybe you've got room in a greenhouse or a polytunnel or a conservatory or something like that, out of the rain. And I'd say for at least a week to be safe, maybe 2 weeks to let them really properly dry off. If you don't have space for that and you don't have thousands of nuts, you can also do it in the oven. So again, just a single layer of nuts in a cool oven at its lowest setting, just for a couple of hours would probably be enough to dry them. So when they're fully dried, then you can store them in something like a Hessian sack or something like that. So you want the humidity to be as low as possible. So dry nuts in a dry Hessian sack, and in a dry place. So maybe the shed that Kat used could have been a damp shed, and the combination of that and slightly damp nuts to start with was the problem. There are other ways to store them as well. Of course, you can. They'll store the longest when they're kept in the shells. They can keep for maybe even up to 3 years if you keep them in their shells fully dry. But there are other ways. So you can crack them, and the kernels you can keep in the fridge. You can even put them in the freezer. You can salt them, just pack them in layers of salt, or you can roast and salt them. And there's also pickled walnuts, which is completely different in that you pick them in the summer before they start hardening. So they're the round, the green outer casing is intact then, and then you prick them and store them in vinegar, and they turn black. And it's a bit of a delicacy, which some people like and some people hate. But so lots of possibilities.
Wonderful, Piers. Thank you for that answer. And that was quite thorough. Then I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add, or if you'd like us to move on to the next question.
No, I think we can move on. Yeah, I think nuts. It's good to think of you think of them as dry, but even they have a little bit of moisture in, so that initial drying makes the difference, really, doesn't it? So, yeah.
Wonderful. So let's move on to question 2 here and see what someone would like to know. So Evie asks, what should we be doing now in our plots, or should we let the ground rest? So right now, it's January. It's pretty much the coldest time of the year. All of us are in slightly different climates. I'm actually over in Canada, where we have about 1 meter of snow. So right now, we are letting the ground rest by default. However, in England, you've got a little bit more potential. So then, would you like to tell us a bit more at this time of year what your own personal approach is, or what you would recommend to someone else?
Yeah, so typically in the temperate world, really, it is a time of rest. There's not a huge amount of biological activity going on in the soil. So we don't tend to sort of meddle with the soil and dig and plow, all of those sort of things. I mean, most of us, I would subscribe by the sort of minimal dig till philosophy anyway. However, and certainly, I mean, you may not be even able to because it's sort of frozen. But if your ground isn't frozen and your soil is exposed, it is a good idea to cover it. So you could use sort of a cardboard or wood chip mulch, just cover that, and that will over the winter must slowly break down and improve the structure of the soil. That's something you could do if your soil is not covered. The other thing this time, the only sort of exception to that rule is if you are planting trees and shrubs, winter is the right time. It's typically the best time to plant trees because they are dormant at this time. So there's less stress in terms of sort of heat stress and water stress for those trees. Typically, you would actually do it even earlier, sort of like at the early winter. So there's enough warmth in the ground for the roots to establish as well. But short of that, this is actually a good enough time to plant trees. So that would involve obviously digging a bit. That's something you can do. I assume based on the question you're talking about sort of ground preparation, that sort of thing, but also other activities that you can do gardening wise at this time of year would be tree related. Again, you can do pruning of apples and pears. So your pome fruits, that would be something you can do. And also starting off your sort of plants that need extended growing season, your tropicals, etc., your tomatoes, you start them as seedlings indoors. So you're sort of planning ahead. So those are some things you can definitely get on with at this time of year.
Wonderful. And Piers, is there anything you'd like to add? Maybe activities you're doing in your own garden right now, or any advice you'd have for somebody?
Well, I just mentioned that I've just yesterday started sowing the garlic. So, and I was able to do that because, as I say, it's mild here at the moment, and I know it's going to be mild for the next couple of weeks. We've got no hard frosts on the immediate horizon, although of course there's plenty more time for more frosts in February, March, etc. So yes, get the garlic in if the ground's soft and you haven't got it in already, because some people plant it in the late autumn. And you know, it's, I mean, in a week's time, it's going to be February, isn't it? So suddenly we'll have other things that we can do, like starting off the broad beans. If you haven't planted broad bean seeds in the late autumn, then you've got to get them going. So you can start them off maybe in pots in a greenhouse or indoors, and then get them in the ground in February.
Wonderful. So let's see what our next question is. I know we have a bunch of wonderful questions to get through today. So can you give some tips for selecting cold hardy and early maturing plant varieties that thrive in cooler temperatures during this time of year? So we've got that question from Dave, who's in Darlington. So Piers, do you have any recommendations here for cold tolerant varieties?
Well, the two tips which first came to mind, which might sound a bit obvious, but the first one is to ask your neighbours, which may be neighbours where you live or neighbours on your allotment plot, who are already growing veg, and they may be able to suggest that in your particular environment what varieties are doing well. Another really obvious thing is to get a couple of seed catalogues and look through those, because they're really good at mentioning for every variety when they can be sown and when they'll be harvested, etc. So you can make up your lists from that depending on where you live. So, you know, at the moment in the ground there's leeks and kale and winter lettuces. Of course, it also depends on how much cover you've got, whether you've got greenhouse polytunnels, stuff like that. But yeah, I always find the seed catalogues just a really easy way of checking out varieties.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that in general, cruciferous vegetables do much better in cooler weather than almost every other type of vegetable. So, you know, here, as soon as our snows are gone, quite early in the season, I will have all sorts of cruciferous greens growing in my garden well before I could plant, you know, squash or tomatoes or anything, you know, that's frost tender. And there are some really nice varieties of you know, tatsoi and bok choy. They can actually be producing leaves within just a few weeks, sometimes before we can get, you know, most of our main crops into the ground. So I'd certainly check out the wide variety of cruciferous greens that are available. So let's move on to our next question here. So does anyone know anything about the wassail apple ceremony? This is a question here from Tom. Fan, I think, did you have some familiarity with this?
Yes, wassailing is a fantastic tradition in this country, and it's really about um, blessing the trees for good health, paying your respects, your offering gratitude for those trees. And it's really it's what I think of as that sort of last vestige of an old tradition, probably Celtic in origin in this part of the world, where trees are not just thought of as this sort of trees and plants are not just thought of as these sort of extractive commodities that we take from, but also as living beings with a living spirit that we can communicate, and our energies and their energies sort of commingle, and they pick up on good vibes. That's the idea. And of course, all indigenous land-based cultures have similar ceremonies for various different crops, like sort of offering things in return for harvest, and thanking the earth. So that's what the wassailing ceremony about. The wassail literally means to good health, probably where health comes from. Wassail, Hael. So That's really that tradition. It's very still alive today particularly in the cider growing regions in the southwest, but increasing in popularity. I think we are seeing more and more of a revival generally.
Well, thanks. It's a word that I had heard before that I didn't quite know what it meant. So thank you for telling us a little bit more about its history. So let's bring up our next question here. How can I extend my growing season in late winter and early spring? And what are the best practices for protecting plants from frost? So it's a question from Doug from Manchester. And again, we can see in the winter, people are very interested in this idea of what can be done right now. How can we get more out of our gardens? So Piers, I know you've been doing gardening 4 seasons. Can you tell us a bit about some strategies for season extension and protecting the crops?
Well, it's all about cover in this part of the world. So if you're lucky enough to have a greenhouse or a polytunnel, then you can do an awful lot more in terms of extending the season at both ends, growing later into the year and then starting earlier in the spring. If you don't, but you have something like a conservatory, that's great for starting off seeds growing in trays and things like that. But these days, there are so many other types of cover that you can make or buy for smaller spaces. So if you don't have room for a greenhouse or a polytunnel, or you can't afford it, then you can make some cold frames or buy them. And there are all manner of cloches and other sorts of devices that you can use to cover crops and give them some protection from the weather. And doesn't need to be expensive. It can be things like if you find some old plastic bottles, you can cut them in half and use them to protect individual plants, like maybe young cabbages that have started producing leaves. And also from protection from frost, then things like horticultural fleece is an obvious one to if you know there's a hard frost coming, like there was a week ago, to cover all your tender plants with those. If you're using raised beds, that makes it a bit easier because you've got something to put the fleece over and to peg it down on. And also bubble wrap can be really useful. And these days when a lot of stuff we tend to have delivered rather than go out and buy in shops like we used to. A lot of us end up with huge amounts of bubble wrap, and I always save the bubble wrap because that can also be really useful for protecting both individual plants, and also if you do have something like a greenhouse or a cold frame or something like that, you can line the insides of it with bubble wrap, and that gives you even more protection.
And Piers, if you were going to protect an individual plant with bubble wrap, can you tell people what method you would use?
Well, it depends on the size of the plant, of course, but I'd probably, let's say it's a small cabbage, I'd probably find something like a plastic bottle, and I'd just cover the outside of the plastic bottle with the bubble wrap so that it's not squashing the plant down, and put it on that way.
I was also imagining having maybe a few stakes in the ground and just kind of surrounding the whole thing with bubble wrap if there's a bigger plant and we need to protect it. But
Yeah,
that's an
well,
interesting
you
one.
can, yeah, you can do that. And with some tender plants like tree ferns, for example, or bananas, they're quite often protected just by completely wrapping them in bubble wrap for the winter period.
And then if you have anything you'd like to add about season extension, I know you're working with perennial plants a lot too, so I'm not sure if you have anything you'd like to add about protecting perennials or protecting trees or anything else that you might do in terms of plant protection and season extension.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely something to be said for good design when you're planting a tree. So there might be pockets in your particular growing space which is a bit more sheltered. We've in my parents' garden, which we were gardening last year, there is a particular plant called a Chilean guava, which doesn't like sort of frosts really. But there was one little pocket in our garden which is more sheltered than the rest of the space when we've put it there. So it's a little bit of consideration before just putting plants in. Generally, perennials do. They're a bit hardier. They've got more sort of root system. So I find that they are a bit more sort of frost tolerant as well. Generally, you're edible, but not always the case. But the perennial kale is absolutely fine, which I find with this. I mean, kale generally also, but lots of your perennial veg tend to be quite frost hardy. The other thing I've tried here and there is sort of spray, generally with damage to flowers in your fruiting trees caused by sort of unseasonal frost. Spraying with water beforehand sometimes sort of helps increase your sort of lower the melting point and sort of reduces the sort of damage. So different strategies really, well, physical barriers, positioning, and few interventions like the spraying.
Wonderful. Yeah, and we've done that with some of our fruit trees before, because we can sometimes have situations here in Canada where in the spring, you know, the temperature will rise for 2 or 3 weeks. The flowers will start to bloom on the fruit trees, and then we get a frost. Yeah, so just spraying the tree with water can really make a big difference in terms of keeping those flowers on the tree and viable. So let's move on to our next question. See what we've got here. So this is from Sarah, who had blight on tomatoes in her greenhouse in 2023. Do I need to remove the soil that the tomatoes were grown in to prevent blight in 2024? And are there any other things that she can do to prevent tomato blight this season? So I'm just going to give a bit of context to this question, because I actually know Sarah and I've spoken to her about this. Sarah was actually a gardener in very hot, dry weather in California for like 15 years. And then she moved back to England last year. And so she has a greenhouse and a garden outside. But in California, she never had to deal with blight, because in hot, dry weather, blight doesn't necessarily show up, and it tends to show up more in humid weather. So coming back to England, she's had this challenge of suddenly having to deal with blight for the first time ever, and losing a bunch of tomatoes, and trying to figure out how to navigate that. So Piers, would you like to tell us about some of your strategies or recommendations for dealing with blight, avoiding it, and what to do with that soil?
Okay, well, certainly what some people do is if they've had blight 1 year in a greenhouse, like in this situation, then the next year they would just avoid growing tomatoes altogether. So that's one way that will help. But let's assume that that's not desired in this situation. So yes, there will be spores in the soil. They will have gone everywhere. So that is a problem. And it sounds like the tomatoes were actually grown in the earth that's in the greenhouse. So yes, ideally you would remove some of that topsoil. So maybe a couple of inches or something like that, and then you can take it away and just spread it somewhere in the garden as far away as possible from where you're going to grow tomatoes or potatoes in the current year. Another thing is, of course, tomatoes can grow pretty well in pots. So what I would probably do is, as well as removing it, the top layer of the soil this year, to grow tomatoes in pots, obviously with fresh compost inside. So that would certainly mean there were no spores in that soil. It would probably be a good idea to disinfect other things that we use, like canes, secateurs, all the stuff like that you would use directly on the plants. Disinfect them if you can, or use canes that weren't used in the greenhouse last year. And then another thing that can be done is to and this is easy if they're in pots, is to make sure that the plants aren't growing too closely together, because the enemy is humidity here. So if you have the plants spaced more apart, that's better. And when you're watering them, don't water the leaves of the plant, but just water straight into the soil. And the final thing to mention is that because blight tends to come along later in the season, maybe this year concentrate on the varieties that fruit earlier. So again, seed catalogues will help you with that.
Yeah, and you can look also for blight-resistant varieties of tomatoes. If they're blight-resistant, that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't get blight. It just means that they might be able to still have decent production, even if they do get blight. So you can, look into which varieties are more recommended. And another thing you can do too is remove some of the lower leaves from the tomato plant, because sometimes the spores are kind of going from the soil to those lower leaves and then working their way up. So you can remove some of those lower leaves so that they don't touch the ground. And again, just as Piers was mentioning, trying to get some of that humidity away from the leaves through spacing the plants, but you can also work on ways that you can increase your air circulation, just to try to move some of that humidity away. So there's a number of things you can do. It doesn't mean that everything's going to work out, but there's also that question too of, are you still getting a harvest? I know in situations here in Canada we don't have as much blight, but we do have other fungal diseases on our cucurbits. And my way I look at it sometimes is, am I getting a harvest or not? If I'm still getting a harvest, okay. And if I'm not getting a harvest, then I need to look at more interventions, or as Piers mentioned, just not growing that plant for a year or two, just to give your soil some time to grow something else for a while, and there's less likelihood that the same disease pressure will show up in the future. So let's move on to our next question here. So how do you secure sufficient nutrient inputs in a vegan organic food production system based on a mix of annuals and perennials? So far, I found it difficult to see how I can add enough nutrients to the cycle of annuals without overworking myself and without the use of animal manure. My compost, both from the toilet and from food, is just not sufficient. And this is a question from Thor. So who would like to jump in on this question?
I can go.
Wonderful, Than.
So in the veganic way, really, we want to be using green manures. Green manures are really crops that we grow for fertility, to build the soil, to build the structure of the soil, to mop up nutrients, and they get put back in. So you can do that in the in the overwintering period. So when there's a gap, you can do that. Or if you can get the timings right. Now this is actually a bit more of a skilled. It requires sort of experience to sort of find out where to be able to plant your crop in situ. But you sort of need to get the timing right, because if you do it too late, the green manures might swamp your crop, or reverse if you sort of sow your green manures too late. So that's something you can do. But generally, other than that, organic principles rely very much on crop rotation, which is at the heart of sustainable growing. And really, that's about moving plants around the soil in successive seasons to optimize nutrient uptake. So if you plant to simplify, if you're planting groups of crops, families of crops which are very nutrient hungry year after year in the same space, that will deplete your soil. But if you can sort of mix a crop that's not so demanding after a heavy one, which can mop up any residual fertility in the soil, that will be a far more efficient use of the soil nutrients. So with a combination of those approaches, as well as soil amendments like your compost and what you're saying, there should be enough nutrients going around and cycling in your system.
And one thing I'd like to mention too is that when we're looking at a gardening system and we have this issue that we might not have enough compost materials, it's important to remember how much is already going to the landfill. There can be restaurants down the street that are putting all of their compostable materials into the garbage, neighbors who are doing that too. And so when we're looking at a garden scale, we can ask ourselves that question: are there nutrients in my neighborhood that people are already throwing out? Are people already throwing out their leaves? Are there, wood chips that are being thrown out? And there's really quite an abundance right now. If everybody was gardening, or if we had a 20-acre farm, then absolutely green manures is pretty much the only way to go. But right now, we live in a society where there's just an abundance of nutrient waste that's just going straight into the landfill and never to return to the nutrient cycle. So if you can keep those nutrients in the nutrient cycle by just gathering them from different places in your community, composting them and putting them in your garden, that's a wonderful way to go. And then what Dan's talking about is fantastic in terms of really having self-sufficiency, really being able to grow your own nutrients right on your own land, especially legumes that are nitrogen fixing, that can bring more nitrogen into your system. And anyone who's growing on a farming scale vegan organically is using green manures, because it's not necessarily realistic to bring in too much from outside. And in terms of annuals, you can look at some annuals that create a lot of biomass. We were talking about fava beans. Fava beans create so much biomass when we grow them, and we can just actually put those residues right back on our garden beds. We don't even have to put them in a separate compost pile if we don't want to. We can basically chop and drop them right onto the garden. The organisms in the soil will break that down. So there are some types of veganic gardening that really focus on that idea, like how can you grow as much biomass as possible in your garden and then just return that to the soil to kind of keep up that fertility cycle. Another thing to mention is, again, perennial plants actually have a lot more autonomy. They have deeper root systems, more extensive root systems. They're growing year round. There are a lot of nutrients down in our soil. There's a lot of phosphorus down in our soil. There's a lot of potassium down in our soil. But a little carrot or lettuce with its little root system isn't necessarily going to be able to go and access that as well. Whereas if you have a raspberry patch that's there year after year after year, that's got a more extensive root system, and it's going to be able to go and access those nutrients more easily. So that's one of the nice things about perennials too, is they have that extra autonomy kind of in every respect, in terms of being able to seek out water more easily, but also in terms of being able to seek out nutrients. Piers, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, just that, like Fan said, green manures are so useful, and I've known about them and I've used them for years, but it's from following Ian Tolhurst that I really realized how useful they are. So Ian Tolhurst, he runs a veganic farm in Oxfordshire. It's not huge, it's only about 20 acres, I think, but he's been doing this for decades, and he keeps meticulous records about all the different techniques that he's tried over the years and the results. And so he is the guru of veganic gardening, and he does it very successfully on a commercial scale. But yeah, he uses loads of green manures, and so it's after following him and reading his wonderful book Growing Green that I learned a lot more about green manures, and I use them all the time now.
Yeah, and I want to mention that back in November, we ran our first ever Veganic Summit, and Ian Tolhurst was one of the speakers, talking about his crop rotation, which includes green manures. Helen Athow also did a talk about living mulches, which is very similar to the idea of green manures, where you're growing your own source of fertility. And if anyone wants to check out those talks, they're actually still available at veganicsummit.com. You can still sign up for free and watch those talks. So it's a wonderful way to learn directly from Ian and Helen, who have both been doing this for decades. So let's move on to our next question here. We use waste wood from tree surgery in our wood burning stove and generate a significant amount of clean wood ash, which I understand to be a good source of potassium. Yes, it is a good source of potassium and a great source of calcium too. I have been adding some to my compost bins and also sprinkling it thinly directly onto the soil to let rain gradually wash it in. And I think we have a little bit more to this question. I've got the written version over here. However, I was told that this was risky because caustic salts can damage the plant roots. Have you experienced any problems directly attributable to wood ashes? And what is the best way to utilize them? So have either of you been using wood ash in your own gardens?
I have in the past. I did used to have a wood burning stove, so every time I cleaned it out, I would store the wood ash, and I did exactly the same thing. I put some of it on the compost and spread some of it thinly on the beds. And so it sounds like you're doing exactly the right thing, and I certainly never had any problems with that. So yes, the reported problems are some of these salts can just be too caustic for plant roots and things like that. That tends to be the case if you add too much. Another possible thing that you can do if you're worried about that is to spread the wood ash somewhere else in the garden and let the rain get to it for a while, and initially the rain will wash out some of these salts, but not all of the good stuff, not all of the potassium and calcium that you want. So you can do that for a while, and then when it's had a few rainfalls on it, then gather it up and again sprinkle it thinly around your beds, and probably not right up to the plant stems so that it's actually touching the stems, but just generally around the area. But I didn't see any problems myself when I was doing the same thing.
Great. And yeah, I also got the sense from the question that the person who asked the question is already on the right path in terms of thin layers in the compost, thin layers out in the garden. And so it is very alkaline. So it can make the soil more alkaline. So that is something to keep an eye on, because if you make your soil way too alkaline, then your plants can have difficulty with some types of nutrient uptake. So again, you want to be relatively relatively thin layers and not overusing it. And also, if you have plants that really like acidic conditions, like blueberries, well, then it might not be the best match for them. And also, just on the note of it being very alkaline, you don't really want it in your eyes. You don't really want to accidentally breathe it in. For example, if you're just putting this out on a windy day and you end up breathing some of it in, that's really not good for your lungs. So even though most of us don't necessarily do it, the recommended precautions are to wear goggles, a mask, and gloves while spreading it. Again, many of us don't do that, but if you don't do it, you want to be extra careful because you don't want to breathe in a mouthful of this. Then, I don't know, would you like to add anything else?
Not really, no. As in, if you're already on chalky or limestone soils, which are alkaline, maybe sort of on the side of caution, and also timing of it. So maybe not immediately before you're growing, but let it sort of dilute a little bit and let the rains wash out the salt. So that could be something to think about as well.
Great, and I think we have maybe one more question here before we wrap up. Or perhaps that's all the questions. Let's see if we have one more that pops up on the screen. We'll see. Oh, okay. I think that was our last question of the day. Well, thank you, Dan, who's been the maestro in the back, sharing your questions with us. I'd like to remind you that you can sign up for the free newsletter from the Vegan Organic Network. So go to the Vegan Organic Network's website, sign up for the newsletter. It's a wonderful newsletter because you get information about upcoming events and about courses and about Veganic Gardeners Question Time and all sorts of other activities, even some in-person activities in England. And you can join and support the work of the Vegan Organic Network by becoming a member. And people who are members of the Vegan Organic Network can get a copy of this awesome magazine called Growing Green International, which is full of stories, advice, and information about how you can grow a garden or a farm using entirely plant-based organic techniques. So thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Veganic Gardeners Question Time. Thank you, Piers. Thank you, Than, for joining us here and sharing your advice. And this is a monthly show, so if you tune in again in February, you can have your questions answered. You're welcome to send your questions in ahead of time so we can make sure that we get to them. And thank you, Than. Thank you, Piers. Thank you, Dan, in the background. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day and a wonderful start to your gardening season.
Bye, everyone.